So Adobe is changing the world through digital experiences. Whether you realize it or not, Adobe probably had a part in the movie that you watched last night, or the TV show that you watched last night, the newspaper that you read this morning, or potentially the last product that you purchased. Adobe, when most people think of Adobe, they think Photoshop. We're a little bit more than that. Not only do we allow you to create content, we allow you to deploy that content across multiple devices, pretty much any device you want, any screen you want, as well as we enable you to measure the impact that that content has on citizen behavior across all channels. My name is Nils Engel. I'm a solution consultant. I obviously work for Adobe. I promise this is the last slide I'll show about Adobe, but I did want to give you some background in regards to who I am. I've been working there for about 10 years. I've had about 10 years experience helping organizations, agencies build data sets that enable advanced citizen-level analysis, behavioral analytics. I've helped build over 50+ data sets that enable this type of analysis. I've been asked to come here today and talk about my points in regards to what the key considerations are when you're building one of these data sets out. And so that's what I'm going to be going through today. So before I dig into how you go about building a data set like this, let's talk about why it's important. The government has released a lot of regulations that mandate improvements in current processes, improvements in how citizens can get to access different programs. We need to, in order to be able to improve those processes, we need to get a good understanding of what citizens think are good, what citizens think are bad. In addition to that, citizens have a plethora of different channels with which they can access these different programs. We need to be able to measure that citizen across those various channels. Historically, when we look at measuring how citizens are accessing programs and what their behavior looks like and what they think is good or bad, there's been a lot of different ways we could do it, but all of them were very manual. Individual face-to-face interviews, symposiums. All of these took a long time to get through. In some cases, the typical feedback loop was between 12 and 18 months. It's hard to be nimble and affect change when you're waiting 12 to 15 months or 12 to 18 months before you get data around what's working and what's not. That's the old way of doing things. The good news is that we now have new technologies that are available that enable you to get data back much faster. Number one, the collection of the data can be made much faster. In addition to that, the access to the data is much more nimble. This enables agencies to dig a lot deeper into the data and get a much better understanding of the behavior of the citizens and what's driving good behavior, what's driving bad behavior, and where are there areas where we can find efficiencies. The results of this? Faster feedback loops, going from 12 months, 18 months, down to weeks, sometimes days, sometimes hours between understanding what's working and what's not. This drives a culture of change. We can start trialing and testing different versions of a process or a program to understand what's working and what's not. This is a path that I typically take as I'm working with a client in regards to how we build this analysis data set. I start with understanding what the analysis goals of the agency or the organization is. Then, based on that, I determine what sources of data need to be loaded in order to answer those questions. The next step is to determine what's the right analytical platform to use to answer those questions. And then lastly, do the actual analysis, always with the goal of trying to get there quickly. Once we have our answers, we can start testing different versions of a process or a procedure or a page on a website to determine what its impact is on that process. And this is iterative, continuously testing changes and making sure that there's a positive impact, ultimately with the goal of optimizing the process. I put together this checklist. This is basically what I go through, and I'm going to walk you through how I go through each one of these steps along the way. The first piece is defining the questions that need to be answered from the data that we have accessible to us. So I'm not sure if anybody here was in the session before, but the speaker before also mentioned it's typically not possible to determine exactly what all of the questions that are going to be asked of the data are going to be. We might get a view into some of them, but we might not know all of them. We need to start with high-level questions. Get at a high level, theme-wise. What are the types of questions you want to ask of your data? From there, we can start drilling deeper into the specific requirements. And based on the different groups within an organization that you may be working with, you may have completely different analysis goals, which may result in multiple analysis data sets. Typically, I like to start with understanding what are the questions that you guys have a really hard time answering today, or potentially are impossible to answer today. Let's start with those and see if we can answer. We can drill deeper and start understanding what are the goals of the agency, today's goals, and start building off questions from those goals. Ultimately, after we've received the questions that need to be answered of the data set, we can start determining what are the sources of data that need to be loaded in order to answer those questions. This is a process. You need to sit down with stakeholders within IT typically to understand what data sources are available. Are the data sources that are required to answer those business questions available to answer those questions? If not, do we need to potentially look for collaboration across agencies to get the data that we're looking for? Or potentially put new processes in place to gather the appropriate data. There's also a requirement to gain an in-depth understanding of what the data is that's being loaded. We need to understand field by field what the data is and attribute by attribute what it represents. We're at a conference for big data. It's a lot of data out there, right? There's a lot of data about your citizens that's out there. And I think a real key capability or requirement is being able to filter out the noise. You have very specific analysis goals that may be key to your agency. Let's focus in on the data that's required for that. We can look at all of the data, but we're going to be lost in the noise, right? There's so much data out there. Let's focus in on the attributes of data that are key to answer the specific business questions that are being asked. I like to call that filtering out the noise. The next phase is determining the analytical platform that's going to be used for analysis purposes to build out the data set. I think that there are some key capabilities that we need to think about when we're building out this data set, and we need to figure out whether or not this platform can support it. I'm going to go through each one of these individually as part of this presentation. So let's drill into the first one, a flexible schema. A schema enables you to define the relationship that attributes of data have to a citizen or whatever it is that you're measuring. By having a flexible schema, it enables you to easily add new sources of data, modify where an attribute of data falls in the schema based on analysis goals, as well as enabling you to flexibly define the relationship these attributes of data have against each other. An example that I like to talk about is web data. When we think about web data, there's the notion of a page view, somebody looking at a page on a website. But there's also the notion of what happened in a web visit. And a web visit is typically defined as somebody coming to a website with no more than 30 minutes of inactivity between page views. The schema allows you to define the relationship between a page view and the visit that occurred. Well, what if we want to take that a step further and understand what happens in what I like to call cross-channel session, where somebody may start a process online, but for whatever reason abandon that process and then jump in and call into the call center and complete the process over there. Now we need to look at, again, what I call a cross-channel session, where we start looking at engagements that are occurring across multiple sources of data. A flexible schema enables you to define the rules that break up a citizen may have multiple cross-channel sessions, and within those cross-channel sessions there may be visits and calls into a call center. These rules can be modified on the fly. This is a key capability to think about as you're building out your data sets, in my opinion. In addition to that is a fully correlated data set. So based on how the data is defined in the schema, We want to have access to any attribute of data that exists in the data set. And we don't want to have to think of it from a reporting perspective of, has somebody pre-thought every question I'm going to ask of the data and pre-built cubes that pre-aggregate answers to questions. Instead, I want to have access to every attribute of data so that I can slice and dice the entire data set on the fly based on the question that's being asked at that very moment. This enables ad hoc analysis. This enables exploration of your data as you start seeing anomalies in the data. Restating citizen data. This is a key capability as well. Let's go back to the web example. I may go to a website 5 times before I ultimately become known, or I log in, or I register on that website. Let's say I have a visit this week, a visit next week. I have a visit each week for 5 weeks, but I never log in. You don't know who I am. The only identifier that's available in the data is a cookie ID or an IP address, or maybe information about the browser or the operating system that I'm using. In most cases, organizations would track that at a cookie ID level. So you'd see an unknown visitor coming to the website. But at some point in the future, I may log in. At that point, we can associate a citizen ID, some sort of identifier for that citizen, to that cookie. Most platforms are really good at the point when the ID is matched, point forward, being able to align data at a citizen ID level. What they're not good at is bringing in that historical data and aligning that historical data at that citizen ID level as well. We want a platform that enables you to go back into that historical data and associate that now known citizen ID with that now known, or with the historical cookie ID data. Restating the data, injecting that ID in the historical data. The next piece of it is the ability to wipe, completely erase a data set, and then reload it from the historical data that's been restated. So that now this person who was historically being tracked at a cookie ID level can now be tracked at a citizen ID level, even though they didn't become known until today. Not only that, but it enables you to apply new rules against the data as well. So as analysis goals change, as new sources need to be loaded, we can completely wipe out the data set, apply new rules against the data, and enable you to have a completely different data set built for you. What's the value of being able to restate the data and reload the data? It enables you to stitch a citizen, an individual, together across the multiple devices, potentially cookie deletions that they have, into a single view of an individual. Another key capability, sequencing data by time, enabling you to see the sequence of events that have occurred for an individual across all channels. This enables pathing. It enables you to see the specific path that an individual is taking to whatever end goal it may be that they have. This allows you to start seeing where a particular process or program may have an error or a problem, and we can now start testing changes and seeing how that impacts the path that a person takes, regardless of whatever the process is that they may be going down. Let's go through a scenario. Let's think of a citizen who's been sent an email campaign. In this case, the example is going to be kind of DMV related, so somebody who wants to renew their license. Maybe they're sent an email campaign that tells them that they can renew their license online if they'd like to. Maybe a couple days later, they're sent a direct mail piece that, again, tells them that they can renew their license online if they'd like. At some point, that person makes it to the DMV website, hits the home page, looks at a couple pages around renewing their license, doesn't log in, doesn't become known, doesn't enter in their driver's license ID, and then goes to the Contact Us page. When they came to the site, they actually came through a Google campaign. So there's a couple of marketing touches that are trying to drive citizen behavior here that ultimately drove that person to the website. They started the process online, but they didn't complete it. Instead, they called into the call center and they completed it there. There's an offline conversion, if you want to measure that as a conversion, that's occurring in the call center. But there's a giant wall between the offline conversion and the behavior that occurred online, because the person was not known online. But what if after that call center conversion, an email is sent to that individual that drives them back to the website to check on the status of their renewal. At that point, if they click on the email or on the link in the email, we can capture an identifier, a citizen identifier, which means that that visitor can now become known in the online channel. What that means at that point, because of the capabilities that I was just talking about, the ability to restate data, the ability to go back into that historical data and inject that now known identifier, as well as the ability to reload the data and sequence the data by time, we can now glue all of this stuff together. That wall goes away. And from a marketing perspective, we can start understanding which of these campaigns had the highest effect on driving that person to complete that process, regardless of whether it was online or offline that the ultimate conversion occurred. We can view this from a marketing perspective and look at what marketing is working, what marketing isn't, and allocate our resources effectively or appropriately based on what's working and what's not. But we can also look at it from a completely different view as well, something that we like to call digital seepage, which kind of sounds like a dirty word, but what it enables you to do is start understanding what in that process, what was the step in that process where the person abandoned the online, the cheaper channel, the more efficient channel, and then went into the more expensive call center channel. It's because of this ability to restate data, store the data at a citizen level, as well as see the specific path that somebody's taking, that we're able to do this very specific analysis. Visualization. Visualization is key, I think. So it's one thing to look at data in spreadsheets, right? In columns and numbers in different fields. But if we can visualize the data, we can start seeing specific paths that people are taking, specific behavior that people are taking. It also enables you to be able to visually explore your data and start seeing anomalies that you potentially might not have seen if you were just looking at a spreadsheet. Some of the key capabilities that I think are really important are things like path analysis, the ability to path any attribute of data or groups of attributes of data to see that sequence of events that are occurring. The ability to do affinity analysis across all dimensions, so be able to start understanding the impact that one attribute of data may have on another. Correlation analysis, seeing the correlation that these attributes have on each other, what's driving one thing to occur. The visualization should be configurable. So it should enable you to allow any attribute of data to be visualized in the visualization of your choice. And lastly, another key capability that I think is very important is ad hoc latency analysis. Latency analysis allows you to look at an event that's occurred and start understanding what happened in the day, 2 days, 3 days prior to that event, or the hour, 2 hours, 3 hours prior to that event, as well as what happened afterwards. So when somebody is hit with an email, do we see them in the next 5 days or 7 days doing what we were trying to do, get them to do? Is there one version of an email that might be better at driving those people to do that compared to another version? Predictive. So yes, it's great to be able to look at historically what's worked. It's great to be able to look at, as I make changes and deploy those changes, what's working and what's not. But more importantly, I want to be able to start predicting what's going to occur if I make a change. So correlation analysis is key. It enables you to see what metrics are driving other metrics within a data set. Clustering capabilities, being able to group people into like clusters or like groups. Certain clusters, certain types of people may react one way versus another group and versus another group. We should be able to group them into their different groups so that we interact with them appropriately. And then propensity scoring, likelihood to do something. We can start scoring individuals based on their likelihood to do something so that we can effectively interact with them. What's the likelihood that somebody's going to renew their license online? Let's target the people that have the highest likelihood with our marketing campaign versus blasting everybody. Okay, so once we have that, the next step is to actually do the initial analysis. Typically what we're doing here is we're using the analysis data set, the visualizations to do that initial analysis, determine what happened, why it happened, what drove it, and then try to make changes that may impact bad behavior and optimize those programs. Lastly, we drill into iteratively deploying changes. So based on what we see, we deploy changes, and we start to measure the impact that those changes have. This becomes an iterative approach, and we continuously measure, change, measure, change, measure, change. We have organizations that through solutions like this have been able to increase the types of questions that they can ask of their data without having to increase their staff. Solutions like this provide you with the ability to do what they call have a staff multiplier. They're able to significantly answer more questions with their existing staff and impact the business in a positive way based on that. That's it for my, my presentation. Any questions?
When you use some browser that can delete cookies and extension and all that stuff, how do your system track all those people?
Yep, so there are different ways we can track data. I mentioned that we can obviously use cookies. Another way is to use the IP address and user agent. There are different ways that we can get around that. We can build different data sets based on how we're going to track individuals. Ultimately, there's going to be a percentage of people that you can't track.
Let's say they use Tor. How do you track it?
If they use what, sorry?
Tor.
We'll use any ID we can within a data set. Like I said, there are going to be certain types of individuals who are using certain browsers or applications that hide who they are that we're not going to be able to track, right? So we can look at behaviorally what they did, for example, in a visit, but we won't be able to understand what they did across visits.
And what percentage that you cannot identify?
It's a pretty low percentage, and it depends really by industry. So we have some organizations, financial institutions, for example, where we can track, closer to 80%. A lot of people authenticate who they are. Retailers are typically much lower because most people don't authenticate. Maybe they're closer to 20%. From a government perspective, it really depends on the agency and the likelihood that somebody will log in to do something or become known. Yep. And what a lot of our clients do is they realize up front that they're not going to be able to determine who everybody is. But if they can get 5 or 10% of the people to become known across all the channels, they can start seeing the trends. And that directionally allows them to start understanding what that behavior looks like. And they can make changes based on that 5 to 10% sample, if you will. Yeah.
Some of these tools are kind of hide your identity at a higher level instead of cookies. Would you be able to identify the service provider or the region?
So yes, so anything that's in the data is available to be used to kind of track an individual. When we start looking at ISPs and regions, it can get a little tricky because you might start grouping more and more people into a single tracking ID. I think typically cookie is what we're looking for. If we can't get that, then we typically fall back to IP address and user agent, which is pretty good, and particularly put in region with that. But again, once you have people who are VPNing into corporate networks and that kind of stuff, they start to all look like the same person, right? So, yeah, we'll use any ID we can, though. Yep. A comment to make is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, I do work for Adobe. We do have solutions that enable you to do this type of analysis, and we have a booth over there. We'd love to talk to you guys about it. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, so on the business side of this,
Yep.
you mentioned your DoD, the government side, you give us your nice model, and you got 10 years of experience at Adobe. What have you found specifically in the public sector that's been key to successfully being able to go through this process and actually sort of visualize, predict customer behavior, client behavior, citizen behavior, and then actually deploy processes, procedures, efficiently take a citizen through whatever that process is.
Yep. Yeah, so there's certain data sets.
Probably lecture to itself, but just a couple of key things that you've seen in your experience.
Yeah, and there are definitely certain data sets that I've worked on that I can't talk to you about. But I, the ones that I can talk to you about are data sets that the agency has the ability to, number one, track the person at a cookie level, because certain agencies can't. The ability to then capture that identifier, because again, certain agencies can't. And then glue it all together, right? And the availability of data is key, right? So if you have some sort of identifier that identifies a person in the web channel when they become known, and an identifier that identifies a person in the call center channel, if that's one of the channels you want to load in, we want to be able to kind of match those IDs together, right? That's kind of a key capability that we need to be able to do. And there may be other channels that we want to load in. We need a way of kind of matching that person across the various channels. And it doesn't have to be the same ID, but we need a way of mapping the IDs to each other, against each other, to ultimately build that data set. Once we have that, then we can start doing some really interesting analysis, right? There is definitely a requirement that the agency itself is ready to do this type of analysis from an executive perspective. We really want to make sure that they're pushing from the top down that this analysis is important, and that based on the analysis, we're going to start seeing some changes, right? And we're not just going to do the analysis for analysis' sake, but we actually want to optimize the procedures or programs or whatever it is that we're analyzing. I hope that helps. Yeah, great. Yeah.
So usually, what kind of information you collect from the cookie? What detail?
So are you?
The reason I ask for this is because the paper issue, I don't know all the legal issues. So for legally, what kind of information you collect, and even illegally, you can, but you won't. What kind of information you there?
Well, we try not to do anything that's illegal, for starters, especially since I'm talking to a government group here. I mean, by default, typically the attributes of data that are available from a web perspective, because I think that's what you're talking about, right, are the W3C extended fields, if you're familiar with those. And you can look those up online or on Wikipedia if you want, but it's things like what browser version are they using, what operating system are they using, what was the referrer, so how did they get to the website, and a number of other things, right? IP address. So all of those things are by default available in the data. And then kind of at an agency level, we need to determine what attributes of data are we allowed to do analysis on, which can we collect. Some agencies were not allowed to capture an IP address, which represents kind of geographically where we can translate based on IP address geographically where they reside. So we have to be selective about what we enable or what we allow into the analysis data set. The reality is, if the data is there, we can load it. It's just we typically apply rules based on the restrictions that each individual agency applies to us in regards to the data that we can do analysis on. Does that make sense? I hope I answered your question. Back to you.
I've noticed on a lot of websites that there's access to log in using your Twitter ID or your Facebook ID.
Yep.
That type of login, does that increase the amount of information that you're able to receive in the cookie, or that you're just able to receive, because there's a lot of personal information in Facebook.
Yep.
So I could look at a picture of the person possibly in the city that they're in, and a lot of personal information. Is that part of the cookie package so you can still look at if they log in using those type of logins?
It is. It's typically not really the cookie package, right? It's not actually stored on a cookie. We have to make an API call, or can make an API call to Facebook or Twitter to get that information. But once they sign in with that Facebook or that Twitter, that's kind of saying, hey, I'm allowing you to have access to this data. And there are, I guess, demographic details that are available depending on the social network that you're interfacing with. So we definitely have clients that are loading that data in and enriching the types of analysis that they can do based on that data. Yep, definitely.
What is the name of the product that allows you to do that?
So I was supposed to not talk about products here, but so there's a product that we call Adobe Insight, which is an advanced customer level, citizen level analytics platform that enables visual exploration of the data. That was a great question, by the way. Great, I guess that's it. If anybody else has questions that they don't feel asking publicly or feel comfortable asking publicly, come on up. Thank you.